Okay, thank you very much. Again, my name's Scott Currie, November Sierra 7 Charlie. I've been presenting at Comm Academy for many years now. Usually I discuss Winlink, and we will talk about Winlink today, but I do want to touch on a few other things today as well. Just talking about how infrastructure and ham radio come together and what that might mean for us. Many of you have seen this banner before, and there's a lot of truth into what this says. When all else fails, amateur radio still works. And probably the primary reason for that is that we usually don't depend very much on an infrastructure. We can do communications direct radio to radio without anything else in between. So indeed, we've seen in disaster situations where nothing else is working, but amateur radio is still functional. I'm just going to kind of talk about what my presentation is going to be about here. Amateur radio disaster communications, we pride ourselves on being able to communicate when all else fails. And again, this assertion is based largely on the fact that we do not rely on normal infrastructure to operate, so it can continue to operate during a disaster. In recent years, though, many amateur radio systems have begun taking advantage of infrastructure to add features and functions, make our hobby more interesting. Often repeaters are linked together by the internet. Digital messaging relies on access to servers and the internet, other networks. Even programming your radio might require a network of some sort. So during this session, I want to provide you with some understanding of what kind of infrastructure we might be utilizing within our amateur communications, and then what happens when that infrastructure fails, and what can we do about that. So what is the definition of infrastructure? Okay, here's one. The basic facilities, services, and installations needed for the functioning of a community or society, such as transportation and communication systems. So that's where we play, in the communication systems. And after disaster, we know that our communication systems are far more fragile than we expected and often fail. So what kind of infrastructure are we using in amateur radio? Let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah, many of you have seen this old picture. This was a great advertisement by the Verizon company. They had this guy here, the "Can you hear me now" guy, and he always had the big network of people behind him, right, and the infrastructure back there. And really, that's important because without all of those people back there and the infrastructure, this is a useless piece of technology. Okay? It doesn't do anything at all for us. Another way we might think about infrastructure, or what our infrastructure has become over the years, you see something like this. We have this very complex built-up infrastructure system. All kinds of systems on top of systems on top of systems. But unfortunately, there's this little piece down here that's being maintained by somebody who probably hasn't documented it, and it's kind of precarious, right? And so that's the piece that's going to fail during disaster, and then all the rest of this comes tumbling down. So let's think about where those things are. And can we talk after a disaster? So the answer is, well, yes, we can. Okay, and probably the most common thing that we think about is HF communications. Okay? What do we need to make our HF communications work? Well, we need some power, of course, for the radios. We need some antennas, and they're probably going to be big antennas because we're talking about HF operations. And if we get that all put together and working, we have communications. Okay, well, maybe not. Maybe we have to have propagation as well. Okay, so in HF, we have to think about, how far away are we talking? Are we going to be talking on ground wave or surface wave? Do we have to rely on skywave and the ionosphere and the time of year, the time of day, and all of those things come into play when we're talking about HF operations. So think about those requirements. Do we have that power capability, and do we have the ability to set up antennas and all that? And if the propagation is good and we're prepared for that, we can talk. Let's go a little bit more local. VHF and UHF simplex operations, can we talk there? Well, again, we're going to need power and antennas. Probably the antennas are going to be much smaller. Maybe even the power requirements are going to be much smaller. But yeah, we can talk as long as we have a line of sight RF path between the two ends. And that could be limiting, especially if we're going to try to communicate with two handheld radios like this. Maybe on ideal conditions, we might get a couple miles out of that. Probably more likely it's going to be, a half a mile or something like that. Pretty limited communications. Now, if we've got base stations and we have base station mobile radios that are set up with a external antenna up on the roof, and maybe even with some elevation, now we can probably get some significant distance out of our VHF and UHF stations. But, that's not always what we do in our communication systems. Often we rely on something else. What if we rely on a piece of infrastructure like a repeater system? Okay. Is that going to be available to us after a disaster? So we have to think about that a little bit and what pieces are going to be necessary for that to work. Okay, so now we've got our two handheld radios, but in between them we've got a big piece of infrastructure sitting there. All right, this is a repeater system with all of the pieces and components that have to make a repeater system work. Okay, so we're going to need power, of course, and we're going to need antennas at both ends, like we always had before, and we're going to need a working repeater in between them. And we need to think about that piece of infrastructure and whether it's going to be functional when we need it to be functional. So some things we need to think about. Does our repeater system have backup batteries? Okay? Does it have a backup generator? Is there another source of power that's going to be functioning when the power goes out after a disaster? If we're relying on backup batteries, how long can the repeater operate on backup batteries? Do we have to change settings on the repeater? Maybe drop out this big, massive RF amplifier that's connected to our repeater and run on lower power to extend the time that we can operate under battery power. If we have a backup generator, does it automatically start? And if it doesn't automatically start, do we have people who know how to get to the repeater site and get the generator functioning? Or maybe it has auto start, but it didn't start this time after the disaster. And so again, do we have people who have keys or access to the repeater site? Can you get to the repeater site? What happens if our repeater happens to be on a mountaintop and it's the wintertime and there's many feet of snow between you and the repeater site? And it's going to require a snowcat or a helicopter or something like that to get to the repeater site. Now, that's probably a piece of infrastructure that's not going to be available to us after the disaster. Is it hardened against those known disasters? Okay, so think about the disasters that we might experience in our area. Do we experience floods, and how would that impact us? Do we have earthquakes in our area? How would that impact us? How about fire, wildland fire? We've got to think about that. Many wildland fires have destroyed repeater sites. Earthquakes, is our repeater secure? Is it secured to the wall? Is it bolted to the floor? Is all the cabling secured appropriately? I've been to some pretty ugly repeater sites over the years, and things that I think for sure would not survive an earthquake. So I think about that a lot here in the Pacific Northwest, because that's one of the big hazards that we face here is earthquakes. So make sure your repeater is built to take it and has all of the pieces in place to survive the disaster. And this is a big one. Think about your team. Has your team exercised what it's like to communicate without the repeater? Okay? Everybody, does their weekly nets and everybody checks in. Everything works great. The repeater's always there. It's always functioning properly. And we don't think about it very much. Maybe you need to throw a wrench into the works every once in a while. And, right in the middle of the net, turn off the repeater, or just before the net starts, turn off the repeater and see if people know what to do. Is your repeater part of something bigger? and maybe a bigger network. A lot of times now we've connected our repeater systems to other networks to link repeaters together and extend our range. And this is great. Comes in really useful. But, you got to think about how all of the pieces come together and what might fail. And as a result, how is that going to impact our communication? So maybe we have our little local repeater here, but is that connected to maybe a hub system somewhere? And is that connected to, well, maybe something bigger, maybe a great big network? So maybe we rely on the ability to talk to the other folks that we need to talk to on a different repeater system. And these repeaters are linked together by some kind of a network. That's network infrastructure. And is that going to be available to us after a disaster? Maybe some of the infrastructure will be available to us. So maybe some of these repeaters will be available to us, but not all of them. Or maybe if this hub system goes away as a result of the disaster, all of these links will be broken and none of these repeaters will be talking to each other. So things you need to think about. Maybe you say, okay, well, we use D-Star or System Fusion. All of those systems utilize the internet to link these systems together. So it's great that I can be out here, in Olympia talking on my local repeater, and I'm talking to the folks out here in Spokane to the other side of the state, 300 miles away. But that connection that connects those two repeaters together is most likely the internet. And if that internet system fails at either end as a result of a disaster, then we're not able to do that communications anymore. I might still have local communications, and that's good through the repeater, but I may not be able to link and talk to those remote sites. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have this great big DMR network now. And this is a fantastic piece of infrastructure that allows us to communicate all over the place. I can be, here in my local repeater here and talking to the folks way out here in another state, or all along this, the I-5 corridor here, and the I-90 corridor, and the I-84 corridor. We have that pretty well blanketed with repeater systems that are all linked together. But we have to think about the disaster. What happens if this big subduction zone that we have out here, creates this earthquake and breaks the network connections that we have? Now, this particular network system actually uses a hybrid network. So some of these repeaters are connected together via the internet, and others are connected together via a local high-speed dedicated ham network. And so some of those connections may survive the event and be connected together, and others may be disconnected. So again, you may be able to talk to some of the places you usually can, but not all of them. How do you know that? How do you know whether you're connected or not? Is there any kind of telemetry on your repeater systems that lets you know that, hey, I'm running on battery power, or I'm running on generator power, or hey, the network is broken and we're not connected to everything? These are questions you need to ask and start working your plans out to figure out how you can connect to things. Nothing wrong with using these resources when they're available. I don't want to come across with the impression that it's wrong to have a backup plan that makes use of any kind of infrastructure. If these things are working, they really enhance our ability to communicate. So sure, absolutely make use of them, but you have to recognize when things have failed and what does that mean for our communications. What are we going to do when the big one hits? So it all comes down to planning, really. You really need to analyze your local hazards and how they can impact your operations. If you're not sure what your local hazards are, go to your local emergency management folks. They know. They've had to go through the threat analysis, the hazard and threat analysis, and they've had to document all of that and build their emergency operations plans. So they can tell you what kind of things are going to fail, where the floods are going to be, where the earthquake, the kind of damage the earthquakes are going to do, probably even where power outages are and where landslides are likely to occur, that sort of thing. So that can really help you, work out your plans and understand what kind of things might fail. Understand the failing modes of your resources. Again, if my linked repeater system has gone away, maybe I'm stuck with just my local repeater here, and what kind of coverage does that mean I have? Okay. If I'm using this repeater, am I going to be able to talk to the folks out here? Probably not. That looks like a dead zone to me. Even right here in downtown Seattle, well, it looks like there's some spots here that are not so good. Can I get to this town? Well, yeah, maybe some of it, maybe not all of it. So think about those things. When the systems fail, what's it going to look like? And then you want to develop your plans to mitigate the impact of these infrastructure failures. And then, of course, document your plans, and then train your teams to recognize these failures, and then exercise your plans simulating these failures. Okay, once you have that training behind you, you can be pretty assured that you'll be able to survive the impact and continue to communicate. Okay, you knew I was going to talk about Winlink. I am the Winlink guy. I always talk about Winlink at Comm Academy, so yep, we're going to talk about Winlink. And again, if you don't know what Winlink is, it's the system for sending email over radio. Pretty much dedicated to emergency communications these days, although some people do use it for other purposes as well. Again, Winlink Express is the software, the client-end software, but there's also Gateway and other software packages that are part of the Winlink system, and we'll talk about those a little bit here in a few slides. And many of our government agencies and non-governmental offices or organizations rather have standardized on using the Winlink system for backup communications. Winlink provides us many ways to communicate. We can certainly do HF operations, so that would be long distance over the horizon. I like to say communications utilizing PACTOR or RDOP or VARA HF now. And we also have connectivity using VHF and UHF modes, utilizing either packet radio, which has been around forever, and now VARA FM, which provides us with much higher speed connections. Okay? And all of these connections can be what we call Winlink, and that implies a gateway and utilizing substantial amount of infrastructure. Or they can be peer-to-peer, where we go directly from one station to another station. And I want to talk about both of those things in some more detail here. And most of our Winlink modes are going to use some sort of network or some sort of interconnecting infrastructure. So let's look at the big picture Winlink diagram here. I know this is a busy diagram, but it really kind of covers everything we want to talk about in the Winlink system. So here's our client station down here, and this could be something like an EOC operation, or maybe a shelter, or some other command post or something like that that's been activated after the event. And really what we have here is a computer, of course, and that computer is connected to either a TNC or a sound card. Think of it as a radio modem, essentially, and then, of course, a radio. So we're going to need the usual infrastructure pieces there. We're going to need power for the laptop and power for the radio. Radio is going to have an antenna system of some sort. And again, if it's going to be utilizing HF frequencies, then it's going to be a pretty sizable antenna. So we'll create a message on our system here, and we'll queue it up to be sent out. We'll activate a radio session, and our communications take off either locally using line of sight communications, or over HF, going over the horizon using one of these HF modes. And we're going to connect to a gateway station. Okay? And a gateway station is nothing more than another station with a radio and a radio modem and a computer system that is running the appropriate gateway software. Now that station is going to turn right around and make a connection off to the internet here and forward our messages up to the CMS or common message servers that are part of the Winlink system. And those reside on Amazon Web Services. So quite a bit of infrastructure going on here. Of course, we're using the internet, we're using cloud-based servers, we're using other servers that are connected to the internet. So a whole lot of stuff here that is going to have to be functioning for the system to work in its normal mode. And this is the conventional way that we send messages. Now, once our messages are up here on the CMS, if they're going to a regular internet address, they're going to, again, access the internet and get forwarded on off to wherever that destination station is, or destination computer, that is. Down here at the bottom, I have another example, though. This is peer-to-peer communications. In this case, we have, again, our client system here set up, and we have another client system here, both of them using Winlink Express. Again, another computer, a radio modem, and the radio system, of course. And now we have either a line of sight connection between these two sites or an HF connection between these two sites. At any rate, we have a reliable radio link between them, and we can now just send messages between these two sites. Okay? No using a gateway station, no using the internet, no using the cloud servers. So peer-to-peer is really powerful, and I'm going to talk a lot more about peer-to-peer here in a couple of slides. Okay, so let's talk about these gateway stations, because a lot of our teams have put gateway stations up on the air, and for dedicated use for their team or for general use by anybody in the area. And these can be a very handy tool, but we have to think about if we're reliant on these gateway stations in a disaster, are they designed to survive the disaster? Otherwise, they're not going to be of any use to us during the event. So things we need to think about: are there backup batteries for this station, or does it have a generator? And of course, all the same questions. How long can it operate on batteries? How long can it operate on the generator? Where's the fuel coming from? Can we get additional fuel to the generator and keep the operation going? Does it have a hardened internet connection? And this is a really good question, because if this gateway station is located at somebody's house, it's probably got residential internet service. And although the internet was designed to survive disasters, that doesn't mean that your on-ramp to the internet is going to be functioning. And if you've got residential internet service, you're probably pretty low on the priority list for getting your internet service restored. So think about that. Is this gateway going to be operational and functional for us, after the disaster? And other things: is it securely mounted? Is it secure from tampering? So when you look at the picture here, if I'm thinking of my area here, when I'm thinking about earthquake disasters, is this gateway station going to be functional after a significant earthquake? Well, it's not bolted down. Everything's kind of, even the radios in the computer are not even bolted to the support that it's sitting on. So it's probably going to fall over. Computer's probably going to break. Cables are going to get pulled loose. This station's probably not going to be functional for us. Even if it survives that, again, this is probably at somebody's house, and again, it's going to be using residential internet service. So is that internet connectivity going to fail and not be available to us when we need it the most? We need to think about that. Maybe we need to think about a gateway system that's built a little bit tougher, and I'm very familiar with this particular one. We're using microwave links for our internet connection. We have a rack here. All the equipment's bolted into the rack. The rack is, of course, securely bolted to the wall, and it's connected to the outlet here that is fed from the automatically starting generator system. And the generator system has many days of fuel and also contracts in place to get that fuel refilled when it runs low. The display might fall over, but it's really not needed in this case, because it runs without any intervention by humans. So maybe we need to think about putting some of our gateways together a little bit more hardened. If our local gateways are not operational, then we have to think about using HF gateways. We might have regional or state gateways, so just within the local area, or maybe out to 100, 200 miles, something like that. or possibly long distance gateways out of the area altogether in another state. Okay, maybe hundreds to thousands of miles away. So if it's a local gateway, we're probably thinking about 80 meters or 40 meters, so very large antennas. Distant gateways, we may be 40 meters or 20 meters, so the antennas are getting a little bit more manageable, but still pretty big antennas. We may need to think about using, near vertical incident antenna systems where we're sending the RF almost straight up and straight back down again to cover a local regional area. And of course, on HF, we'll be using either PACTOR or now VARA HF or RDOP. And so that means that we're going to be moving data fairly slowly, right? So we need to be keeping the messages short. We're not going to want to be sending a message with a 100 kilobyte attachment to it, which would take a very, very long time to send over an HF connection. So in my example here, I brought up the propagation links after a connection I made. And so in this case, I'm out here in the Auburn area, and I've connected down to a gateway station that's out by the coast here in Aberdeen. And in this case, the internet was available out here, was not available up here, so we were able to make that connection. Now we're going to come back to this screen this picture because this probably is going to be the other way around. Again, if that subduction zone event happens out here off the coast, this station's probably going to be in bigger trouble and needing to get messages out of that area. So we'll talk about that in a couple of slides here. RMS Relay is another part of another piece of software that's part of the Winlink suite. And RMS Relay gives us the ability to create a variety of different backup configurations for how we're going to handle communications when the internet fails. So some of the things that RMS Relay gives to us are the capability to do store and forward over HF. So we connect to a gateway station, and that gateway station has lost its internet connection. So it will store the message and then forward that message over an HF link to a gateway station somewhere else that does still have internet connectivity. And that may be a few hundred miles away or even thousands of miles away. RMS Relay can also serve as a local message server, either on RF or Telnet. We'll talk a little bit more about Telnet later. So in that case, you would connect to the gateway station, and the gateway station would then store the messages locally in its own local cache. And if the destination station also connects to that gateway, then the message will be delivered to them. If the destination station does not connect, then once the internet has been restored to that gateway station, then the message will be forwarded up through the normal route to the CMS servers. So you have to think about that a little bit. If I've got a gateway station here, it's configured with RMS Relay, and it's configured to do store and local of messages, store locally and deliver them locally. What happens if somebody connects to that and doesn't realize that that's what's going on, and they assume that their message is going to get delivered promptly when it's actually going to stay right there in that local gateway until such time that either the internet is restored or the destination station connects to that gateway and picks up the mail. There is a message that pops up when you do that, when you connect to one of those gateway stations and it's lost its internet connectivity and it's doing local storage. It will let you know that this message is going to be cached locally, and do you want to continue this connection? And if you don't understand what that means and what's happening there, you might say, well, yeah, okay, go ahead, let the message go, when really you should be disconnecting and using a different method. RMS Relay also allows us, is the basis for creating radio-only networks, and really that's kind of what I'm showing here is a radio-only network in this case. It could be a hybrid network, and a hybrid network says if the internet's not available, we will do radio-only communications, and then if the internet is restored, then we will switch back to conventional operation. So that's a hybrid network. But we can configure it to be radio only. Never touch the internet. I only want you to send messages over radio. And so in that case, we've got 3 gateway stations here, and there can be more, of course. I just, for simplicity's sake, we just made it 3. So a client station out here, maybe this is at the Emergency Operations Center or a shelter or something like that. We'll connect to this gateway station with traffic that needs to get over to this station over here. And what's going to happen is the gateway will look up where that destination station is set to pick up their messages from, and discover that it picks up its messages from this gateway here. So we will forward the message over HF to this other gateway. And then this local station can pick up that message off a local line of sight link to that connection to that gateway station. Of course, it can go all the way out, another gateway up here and more gateways connected, et cetera, et cetera. The forwarding will happen automatically. Nobody has to think about what's going on. You just connect to the local station where you always do, and you'll pick up your messages that way. This forwarding takes place over HF using either PACTOR, or now you can also use VAR HF. And so that means, there could be delays. In fact, there are several problems with this. Message delivery may take, many hours. If propagation is not there, we may have to wait until conditions change and propagation opens up, and then that forwarding will take place. Obviously, you can't send messages to internet addresses because there's no internet involved, no way to get it there. And clients have to pick up all of their messages from their designated message pickup station. The big problem with this is it's difficult to set up and to deploy in the middle of a disaster. Okay, so if we've got broken stuff all over the place, and we're trying to build these gateway stations and then get information to all the client stations on setting up their configuration so that they know where to pick up their mail from and where mail has to be forwarded to, that's just very difficult to do in the middle of a disaster. So this has to be planned for and done ahead of time. But if you're in an area that's, maybe kind of rural or out, fairly remote, and the internet is very likely to fail, maybe you want to build up a radio-only network and just have it configured that way all of the time. And then you can have everybody have their equipment set up ahead of time and ready to go during disaster. And of course, you should be exercising it all the time. Okay, let's talk about peer-to-peer, because personally, I think peer-to-peer is a very, very powerful tool. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't take advantage of what you can do with peer-to-peer connectivity. So in this case, of course, no internet is involved. We're going to go directly between client stations. No servers are involved in this. No gateway stations, no cloud servers, none of that. It's just between client stations. And our connections can be local, line of sight, utilizing VHF and UHF frequencies, or it can be long distance, utilizing HF communications. We create the message. So if I had to, I'm here at station A and I need to get a message over here to station B, I will create the message using Winlink Express as a peer-to-peer type message. I'll address it to the call sign at station B, and then I'll open a peer-to-peer session. And station B also has to have a peer-to-peer session open, and we will connect to each other, and the messages will be exchanged. If station B has messages waiting to go to me, they will be exchanged and sent back at the same time during that same connection session. So this is very, very powerful. A lot of people don't understand how peer-to-peer works. That they think that they have to, I have to set up my receiving station to be configured to receive from this station or this station. That's not true. Once you have a peer-to-peer session open, your station will accept connections from any station. So let's think about that for a second. Maybe this is the emergency operations center. All of our connectivity has failed, so we're going to operate in peer-to-peer mode. They would just leave this station on the air in peer-to-peer mode. So you might get the message out over a voice channel that, yes, K7ECC is up and running on VARA FM peer-to-peer on frequency 145.030. So if you need to send traffic to the emergency operations center, make your connection that way. So now this, station B can create messages, send it off to the emergency operations center over peer-to-peer. Likewise, this station can do the same thing, send it down to the EOC over peer-to-peer, and the messages will appear on their screen in there at the EOC. They can then reply to those messages, and if the station connects up again, they will get those messages delivered back, so the responses can be delivered that way. They might even receive a message from station B, type out a response to that, turn right around and send it back to station B. As long as they've left their station in peer-to-peer mode, that message, the connection will occur and the messages will be delivered. So very powerful tool, I think, and underutilized. I really think teams should be testing this out and adding this to their plans so that, when all of the other gateway stations are not functioning properly, they can still utilize peer-to-peer connections. Now, I've drawn a digipeater in here. Digipeating is possible on two different modes on VHF and UHF line of sight connections. So if station B needs to connect to station C here, but does not have a direct RF path, if there's a station in between the two that's set up for digipeating, we can connect to this station or actually relay through this station up here to this station. And digipeating is allowed on packet connections, and it's also now allowed on VARA FM connections. So you really want to understand how to set up a digipeater, and I think that's another skill that we should work on is learning how to deploy ad hoc digipeaters as needed, after the disaster strikes. It can be pretty simple to set up. It could be just a TNC or a radio and an antenna, and you're on the air with a packet digipeater. It might even be, some of our new radios have a TNC built into them, and you can turn on the digipeating function in there. So it might just be a radio and an antenna, and you're on the air. If you're going to do VARA FM digipeating, then it's going to require a computer, because of course VARA is a software application. So you have to have that set up in the computer and then connected to the radio, and of course on out to the antenna. For VARA FM, if you're going to operate as a digipeater, you don't have to have the call sign registered. It'll still operate on full speed as a digipeater. So even if you have a station that is available to operate as a digipeater but hasn't set this stuff up before, they can quickly deploy it, and we don't have to worry about registering their call sign. They will function as a digipeater at full speed. So very useful tool. I think, as I said, I think we really need to focus on peer-to-peer communications much more. Okay, we could do manual forwarding, and I said I was going to come back to this picture once again. Again, it could be, if we had this big subduction zone event out here, this station, Leslie Station out here at Aberdeen, is probably going to be dealing with tsunami waves coming in, and most likely lost all of their infrastructure out there. So most likely the messages are going to go from here out to here someplace. Now, if my station, if it's that big earthquake event, even the I-5 corridor here may be significantly impacted, and I might not even have internet either. but I might have the ability to then turn around and connect, as the propagation map shows here, to a station up in Canada, 402 kilometers away, where the internet is still working just fine. So in this scenario, we create a peer-to-peer message out here. We send it to me. I turn around and create, with instructions in that message that this needs to go to a particular internet address. So I will then change the message from a peer-to-peer type to a Winlink type, and change the destination address, and then connect up to this distant gateway out here, where it will then utilize the regular connectivity from the Winlink system and be forwarded to the internet address. So this is a very likely scenario. Again, we worry about the subduction zone event out here. Our state EOC is down here, probably well within range of shaking after that big event. And so, we have plans to relocate the state emergency operation function out here to the middle of the state, where likely there would be little or no damage. And so it might very well be that we have to do things like this, where we, relay from on peer-to-peer and then go a long distance to a gateway and then back in this way into the EOC. So again, kind of a hybrid network there involves additional manual intervention, but we can still get messages through as necessary. So Winlink can also make use of alternate IP networks. We see that a lot. The use of Arden and ham-WAN type networks. And so I've got the graphic up here of the Pacific Northwest ham-WAN, which is a data ring that's been built from off-the-shelf Wi-Fi equipment in the microwave bands, but utilizing the ham radio frequencies in those microwave bands. So this is it is a ham radio network, but it is a high-speed internet protocol network. An alternate internet, if you will. And we have we've installed these stations in various places around the western side of the state here. And if you're within line of sight range of one of those stations, you can connect up to it and have high-speed internet protocol connectivity. We may even have internet because there are stations that provide that gateway into the real internet. So, we can utilize Winlink using the Telnet protocol to and then use this high-speed network to connect and send information back and forth. Now, you might say, well, if I've got a high-speed IP network, why wouldn't I just use the regular TCP/IP tools that we have available to us? And certainly you could. But one of the things we need to be careful of in that case is, if we're utilizing ham radio frequencies, you have to make sure that the TCP/IP tools that you're using are not encrypting the data. So in other words, if you're using TLS connections or SSL connections, that would be encrypted data, of course, and would not be permitted on a ham radio network. So things like that you need to think about. But one of the things we're talking about doing in our area is putting a RMS Relay server, store and forward server at maybe a one of the emergency operation centers, county emergency operation centers, where they have a good hardened internet connection. And so that RMS Relay function, we can connect up here on Telnet and connect to that RMS Relay, and then that RMS Relay would then forward messages off to the regular internet like it normally does, the conventional way. We could also utilize gateway stations. We could put up gateway stations out here, RMS gateway stations that are then connected to this high-speed network and then pointing down to that RMS Relay instance. Now, the advantage of doing something like that is if the internet did fail here, the RMS relay could store the messages locally. And any of the stations that are connecting through any of this network connectivity and going to this RMS relay would then, of course, get the messages delivered to them. And then once the internet is restored, if they haven't picked up their messages already, the messages will flow through the internet and through the normal connectivity. So again, excellent tools here. A lot of folks around are utilizing Arden type networks. Again, high-speed networks utilizing gigabit or not gigabit, but high-speed IP networks over microwave connectivity. And often these things can be deployed, after the disaster and with true mesh networking support. So when they come on the air, they discover each other, and the network is built dynamically. So utilize these tools if we have them available to us. But again, it takes planning, right? So, as I come to the end of my presentation, and we'll open it up here for questions, of course, things that we need to think about. Our ham radio systems are not exempt from infrastructure failures. We've embraced infrastructure in many of our systems, and that's okay. We utilize those things when we can, but we need to learn to recognize when those failures have occurred and have solutions in place to mitigate the impacts of that, right? And then document and train and exercise according to your plans. And if we do that, then I think we will be successful, and we will have communications when all else fails. So, questions. And my contact information is up here. You can grab the QR code there or just write down the information. I'm always happy to work with folks, and I'm part of the Winlink team that moderates the various Winlink Google groups, and you can find me there, or you can send questions to me directly. I'm happy to answer those.